there is no sense in more armaments right now that mean more deaths. Tens and tens of thousands of Ukrainians have died in recent weeks. It's an utter tragedy. And the one thing that Biden is incapable of doing, and he may literally be incapable of it, is negotiating with Putin. He just doesn't negotiate. He doesn't discuss. He doesn't get at any of the real issues that started this war and that have had the war continue. The United States blocked every off-ramp that was possible because this has been a war to a very great extent about Biden's relentless insistence that NATO will enlarge to Ukraine. And every time that Ukraine has said we can be neutral, the United States has rejected that, thrown the Ukrainians back to die on the front lines, and then just more of this, basically because, as is typical in U.S. failed wars and goes back to Vietnam, you just keep the fighting going no matter how many deaths, how much disaster, until after the next election. That's what Biden's trying to do. But, the next election's a long way off. And that's a lot of people that will be dead uselessly, tragically, if this continues. So I applaud the Republicans for saying, no, this makes no sense. I know part of the response in Congress was, we don't understand what this is for. Part of it was to tie it to border issues. But the bottom line was that they blocked this, and that's the right thing to do. But what Biden needs to do and has refused to do is actually engage in some negotiations with the Russians. And he has not done that for a single day since this special military operation started on February 24th, 2022. And before that, when President Putin put a security agreement draft on the table on December 15th, 2021, Biden said, we don't discuss it. So this is a president that has failed miserably in his role of negotiations. He misses the most basic line, that one of the first lines President John F. Kennedy told us in his inaugural address on January 20th, 1961, let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate. And President Biden is so afraid of negotiating that he has just told the Ukrainians, just go into battle, and it's hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians dead and hundreds of thousands wounded. The country is being destroyed, and all Biden can do is come up with this story that there's no alternative because otherwise we'll be fighting the Russians. The man is absolutely out of reality. I'm sorry to say it.
You may be on to something, Professor Sachs, with his fixation on Putin and unwillingness to speak to him. I don't know if you've seen this clip. It was just yesterday. It purports to be spontaneous. I don't know if he can talk for 2 minutes spontaneously or if there was one of those giant teleprompters behind the television camera. But here he is yesterday speaking to a television camera somewhere in the White House. The most terrifying aspect of this speech is about 3/4 of the way through, where he basically says, if you don't give me the money I want, and if we don't help the Ukrainians out, you're going to see American soldiers fighting Russian soldiers in Europe. I want your thoughts on this. His inner LBJ on Vietnam. I think you're right, Jeff. I think he is out of touch with reality. But please, your comments on a president of the United States suggesting, if I don't get the vote I want, you're going to see American troops fighting Russian troops.
I think it's the kind of ridiculous scare tactics that go back for decades. They come up with anything to keep wars going. The domino theory, which is basically this: if we don't spend waste another $61 billion and tens of thousands of more Ukrainian deaths, the next thing is we're going to be fighting here, then here and here. This is exactly what they said about Vietnam, that all Southeast Asia, the whole world will fall to communist domination and so forth. This is typical. And Biden has been at this a long time. He knows that, I don't know if he knows now, he's a really old man, but he should remember the truth of all of this. Russia wasn't demanding any territory. Russia was demanding Ukrainian neutrality. That's all. Don't push NATO here. And then Biden was part of a covert regime change operation in February 2014 that overthrew a Ukrainian government that was pursuing the policy of neutrality. That's the truth. Victoria Nuland, his undersecretary of state, was caught online saying who was going to be the next prime minister after Yanukovych was overthrown. Then came the Minsk agreements. We've talked about this. The Minsk agreements were an agreement between Ukraine and separatist regions that said Ukraine would enable autonomy for the ethnic Russian regions. And then the United States said, blow it off, doesn't matter. Even though the UN Security Council backed the agreement, Russia said, aren't you going to enforce what you have signed and you're supposed to guarantee? No. Then in 2021, Putin said, stop NATO enlargement, stop the threats to come to our border. And I know, because I called the White House at the end of 2021 saying, avoid this war. Stop. What President Putin's asking for is actually sensible for us. But no, Biden would not even talk about it with Putin. And then in March and April 2022, Zelensky said, okay, we can have neutrality. And they came just to an agreement until the United States marched in and said, don't sign that. We do not accept you, Ukraine, accepting neutrality. And Biden has put in more than $100 billion. It's not as if we've been sitting there doing nothing. We have armed them. We have given them budget support. This is just a disastrously failed effort, and he won't tell the truth, as usual. Just keep it going and then raise the stakes. This is Biden's folly, and it's got to stop.
What do you think motivates them? Do they want to enrich? Is it something as base as enrichment of the military-industrial complex? I mean, he must know that the war is unpopular. Isn't a single American soldier going to wish to go over there to die for Ukraine? Politicians usually are motivated by getting reelected. This doesn't even advance that ball.
These are coalitions of forces. So definitely the straightforward make money for the big five in the military-industrial complex, Northrop Grumman and Boeing and Lockheed and General Dynamics. Yeah, that's part of it, actually. And you can even watch the congressmen. I know some of them. Oh, they just want to sell armaments. And even Biden tried the absolutely unacceptable ploy of showing, you've got to vote for this $61 billion. Look at the jobs in your district, as if the best thing we can do is make armaments and send Ukrainian kids to die. And they were showing them, they were saying, yeah, absolutely, this is good for your district. This is good for jobs in your district. So that's part of it. Part of it is the neocon fantasy of the unipolar world that we can do anything, go anywhere. And NATO expansion was the emblem of that, and that's Victoria Nuland, that's Jake Sullivan, that's Blinken, that's Biden. They've been at this since they were a team in the Obama administration. This goes back a long way, and it has failed. They played a bad hand miserably, and they kept raising the stakes with a terrible hand. I don't even know if they have a pair of twos in their hand, but they kept raising the stakes. Putin kept calling, and they kept raising the stakes. And here he's trying this mad effort at the end when everyone can see who's following this day to day. This is a disaster. It's time for negotiations. It's actually time to say, you stop and we stop. And we got to figure out how to make peace come again. And Biden won't even try. Maybe he's just too old.
Switching gears, Professor Sachs, to the other hot spot. Since we spoke last, the truce has ended. The IDF has resumed its efforts at ethnic cleansing in Gaza. Where is the outrage that you and I remember from the Vietnam years among American academics and intellectuals? You work on the Columbia University campus when you're not traveling the world. Where is the outrage amongst academics about this slaughter?
Well, first of all, there's such a strong attempt to strong arm everybody. Don't say a word about the 17,000 Palestinians that have died. Don't say a word about the million that have been displaced. Don't say a word about the hundreds of thousands of homes that apparently have been destroyed in the bombing. If you say a word, you're anti-Israel, you're anti-Semitic. This is the latest attempt to silence anybody that opposes U.S. policy.
From whom is this? From whom, excuse me, Professor, from whom is this don't say a word command coming? Is it just a social pressure? Is it the administration of great universities?
Well, look, I'm away, but I saw in the press, I read today how the university presidents were grilled by Congress. There's a lot of posturing. This is American politicians have long believed that their ticket to success is to back Israel unconditionally. And what we're doing right now is more than backing Israel unconditionally. We are the suppliers of the bombs that are killing thousands, probably by the end of this, tens of thousands of women and children, innocents in Gaza. And we actually have the president of Israel, Herzog, saying there are no innocent civilians in Gaza. I've never heard such vulgarity from a head of state, and one that we are giving bombs to carry out those crimes. So, yes, there's a lot of attempt by politicians, by any of Israel's backers who must be pretty desperate because the whole world sees massive war crimes right now. So they're trying to stop people from talking about this reality. The young people know it. The students on the campuses see what's happening. There's a huge generational divide that has opened up because young people are aghast at what Israel is doing. And older people expect young people to be in line and shut up. That's basically what they're told.
Is it the public policy, I'm using a typically American phrase here, is it the public policy of the Netanyahu administration that Palestinian women and children are not civilians? That they somehow, by some absurd, bizarre rationalization, are combatants and therefore are fair game for the military to kill?
I think that there is plenty of evidence that the intent of the Israeli government is a mass ethnic cleansing. And many legal scholars say that this is tantamount to a genocide. In the Genocide Convention, one of the crucial points is intent. And boy, the ugly stream of rhetoric that has come out of the cabinet of Israel is absolutely shocking, that Gaza essentially will be unlivable afterwards, that there are no innocent civilians in Gaza. So legal specialists on genocidal intent are collecting these phrases, and the Israeli cabinet is not holding back, I would say, on providing evidence of this sort. So I think the intention was to cleanse Gaza. And the Egyptians said, no, not on our watch. You're not doing that. And the Israelis said, okay, we're going to bomb the north. People should flee for their lives to the south. We know that thousands and thousands could not flee and died under the rubble. Then they went to the south, and now they're bombing the south.
Right.
They're bombing the south. And now we have even stories in the New York Times, which is not exactly an anti-Israel newspaper, that the Israelis are telling the Gazans, go here, and then they're bombing the places that they've instructed the population to go to. And in our context in the United States, our politicians just want performative acts every day of support for Israel. That's all. They don't say a word about thousands and thousands and thousands of innocent people being killed by American bombs. But this is direct American complicity. It's legal complicity. It's moral complicity. It's a geopolitical disaster for the United States. I'm out around the world hearing the rest of the world's views, not the cocoon that the mainstream media or the US Congress has. There isn't anybody that I have come across in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, in the Middle East that has the slightest positive word to say about the United States. The US is just viewed as an accomplice to a massacre. And
here's you mentioned intent, which of course is key in any violation of international law. Although, as you know, international law is almost useless because it's not enforced. The United States vetoes very appropriate offerings in the Security Council. You know this better than anybody. However, here is Secretary Blinken. Poor guy. Looks like he hasn't slept in a week in this clip, attempting to address, and I think in a misleading way, Jeff, but I want your comments, the issue of the intent of the Israeli force. But Professor Sachs, I submit that that is grossly misleading. If Israel understands the imperative of protecting civilians, it's obviously not acting on that understanding. And
first of all,
our intent from what people do repeatedly.
But by the way, when it comes to Israel, they're saying it. So this is clearly Blinken repeating a line by lawyers in the State Department who are urging the Israelis, don't get so far out that you are going to be charged with massive war crimes and perhaps with genocide because your intent is plainly visible. So This is a complete dodge, but a dodge that comes from some lawyer telling Blinken, tell your Israeli friends. Now, here's the basic fact. It's not the U.S. warning anything. The U.S. is shipping the bombs that Israel is dropping on the buildings. That's all. This is American armaments, and it's not American armaments that were stockpiled years ago or weeks ago that just happened to be American in Israeli hands, we are shipping the bombs that Israel is dropping in real time. We are a party to the massacre. And that's Netanyahu says, what does he need from the United States? Munitions, munitions, munitions. And he's getting them in real time. So we're part of this. Blinken is not giving him advice. Blinken is giving him bombs. It's straightforward.
Right.
It's not complicated. And what's amazing for me, Judge, it's not so often you watch massacres in real time on television. We're watching an ethnic cleansing in real time using our weapons, our funding. We are an accomplice to a mass killing. That's it.
Yes. Nobody in the American government seems to understand that, and nobody's even articulating it, Jeff.
No, and what is not discussed at all, because basically they're all liars from morning till night. There are other ways to achieve security. The Arab world has said very clearly that it is interested in Israeli security in a political settlement. They've said that for years. They said that in an Arab Islamic conference just a couple of weeks ago, very clearly. There's a way out of this peacefully. The point, though, is, and it's a very obvious point, the Netanyahu gangsters, they don't want a political settlement. They want Israel in full control. Again, it's not a matter of inferring intent. This is exactly what Netanyahu says, that Israel will control Gaza. So they don't want a political settlement that would give them security. They are aiming at ethnic cleansing. It's an absolute war crime. It's repeated war crimes, but the United States is a party to it. We are every day supplying the bombs that are being used in this mass killing.
How do you see this ending, Professor Sachs?
I see it ending perhaps sooner than we think, when the whole world, except two countries, says it's got to stop. And the United States shakes a little bit because Biden's approval ratings are in free fall, absolute free fall. The Democratic Party is hemorrhaging support, and the support in his foreign policy has disappeared. So maybe someone still alive in the White House to real facts knows that this is a complete disaster from every point of view, but also the only one that they really care about, which is the political one. This is a complete disaster for the administration. This will absolutely drive the American population away from Biden. And so my view is that when essentially the whole world in the UN Security Council and UN General Assembly say it's got to stop, the United States is going to have to bend to the will of the entire world. And that may sound surprising, but I think it's actually going to happen, because this is devastating for American foreign policy, but it's also devastating for Biden's politics.
Do you think it's going to happen when other countries threaten military intervention, or sort of the diplomatic ostracizing of the U.S. and the Israeli governments?
I think mainly the latter, mainly showing that the world is aghast at these crimes. The United States is hemorrhaging any kind of support anywhere in the world. The costs to American foreign policy, to American diplomacy, to American legality are absolutely enormous. And I think this becomes more and more clear. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres invoked a very rare emergency clause in the UN Charter, Article 99, directing the UN Security Council to take up this issue with all urgency. This is very rarely done, but it is a measure of not only the grave crimes that Israel is committing, but a measure of the enormous stakes involved in a whole world that is witnessing slaughter. And so the Security Council will take this up this week. I am hoping that the Security Council not only will push for a ceasefire, and if the United States stands alone in a veto to stop the mass killing, it makes it even more extraordinarily clear the American complicity in this. But I am hoping that the UN Security Council will follow through on more than 5 decades of resolutions that say that the solution to this ongoing bloody crisis is a state of Palestine and a state of Israel living side by side. And for all those who say that's impossible, there's no one to talk to and so on, talk to Saudi Arabia, talk to Jordan, talk to Syria, talk to Egypt. They've just said a week ago, they say every
to allow this aggressive neutrality. He used the term aggressive neutrality of Pakistan to continue. Now, it is no wonder that the hegemon and biggest belligerent kind of is against neutrals. That's just natural. They are second-tier targets. But what surprises me is that these neocons are not willing to use neutrality as a way to create strategic stability, which would be beneficial also to the United States. Do you have an explanation for that?
I think the explanation is straightforward. The neocons are not interested in strategic balance or strategic stability. They're interested in global hegemony. They adopt and pursue the idea that the United States is, should be, and can remain the world's sole superpower. This is absurd in substance, because the United States is not, cannot, and should not be the world's sole superpower. The United States is 4.2% of the world population. It should do its share. It should be responsible. It should promote strategic balance, not hegemony, or what some in the US security state call full spectrum dominance. The neocons are not interested in balance. They are therefore actually undermining balance wherever it is. The whole reason for the war in Ukraine is the United States could not accept a mutually respectful peace with Russia. The United States had to keep moving NATO eastward to surround Russia. The United States does not accept a mutually respectful relationship with China. The United States wants to surround China with its military bases and military alliances. This is why the situation is so destabilizing, because the United States is not, and by the United States, by the way, I don't mean the US people, I mean the security state, which is dominated by this arrogance of unipolarity. They're not seeking stability. They're seeking dominance. And seeking dominance is not only, I think, immoral, but utterly impracticable, because the United States is not dominant. It is one of many powerful countries in the world, but there are many major powers in the world, and the United States seems intent to take them on. It won't succeed, but it will leave bloodshed, massive bloodshed, in the places that are trapped between the superpower fights, and Ukraine is the latest victim. It was a victim that was talked into its role by promises by the United States that we'll defeat Russia together. Of course, in the end, Russia is not defeated, but Ukraine is reduced to rubble. And this is unfortunately the American tendency.
Now, where do you think leaves us this insight, like for neutrality and non-alignment, especially for countries that are really kind of trying to be non-aligned, not this kind of lapdog neutrality that Austria and Switzerland and Ireland are going, because they have already been captured pretty much by the ideology, by the same ideology. But those states in Africa, South America, and India and Southeast Asia that don't want to go along, I mean, this puts a target on them as well, right? The United States will see any kind of third-party policy as inherently antagonistic. I mean, these neocons, the Victoria Nuland types.
Well, I think that from a strategic point of view, each region needs to get together so it's not picking off one country at a time, but actually regions cooperating. So I strongly advocate that ASEAN work together as a group. I advocate that the South American countries, indeed, it would be good if the Latin American and Caribbean countries, but at least the regions, work together as a group. The United States approach is divide and conquer, the old strategy that dates back 2,000 years to the Roman Empire. So it picks off Venezuela, and then it divides Latin America between those who are on the U.S. side against Venezuela and those who are on the Venezuelan side. But what, of course, is the right response for Latin America is don't be divided that way. If you are divided that way, everybody loses. Millions of refugees from Venezuela that came from a brutal and premeditated attempt by the United States to overthrow the Maduro government. And who pays the consequences? All of the region, of course, Venezuela first in a shocking collapse of the economy and social life, but Colombia and other neighboring countries that have become home to millions of refugees from Venezuela. So I'm extremely happy, although it's very difficult, that Lula is back in the presidency in Brazil, because Lula can bring together the Latin American governments to say to the United States also, look, we're not your enemy, but stop dividing us, stop trying to overthrow governments in our region, because we don't want that. And that really needs to be the response everywhere. The United States traps countries in proxy wars, and those countries lose. I tried to tell my Ukrainian counterparts, they were at that time my Ukrainian friends, then they stopped listening to me and wanting to repudiate what I was saying, but I kept warning them, you are going to get trapped by the United States. And this is exactly what has happened.
Do you have any more hope for Taiwan? Because it seems to me the US is trying to do exactly the same now with preparing Taiwan to be an unsinkable aircraft carrier and then have bloodshed without end on Taiwan in order to fight a proxy war with China.
I was just in Taiwan. I was given a wonderful award called the Tang Prize by a fantastic foundation. I spoke to a major Buddhist foundation in Taiwan, the Tzu Chi Foundation. And what a wonderful society, what a successful place. And I gave the warning everywhere that I could, don't get trapped into this U.S. PRC fight, because this would be devastating. The United States basically is led by a lot of ignoramuses. I happen to know a lot of them. They're very poorly educated. They're educated in a kind of American arrogance. They are outdated by 30 years, thinking that the world is just at the U.S. Doorstep, or that the U.S. has the prerogatives, I should say better, anywhere in the world. They don't know what they're doing. And I tried to say to Taiwanese leaders, be careful, because this is really what happened in Ukraine. Now, the U.S. approach is so mind-bogglingly wrong-headed. It says the way to protect a country is to arm it. Well, this is the fallacy that my late and great colleague at Columbia University, Robert Jervis, wrote about for decades, what he called the security dilemma. The United States may look at arming a country as a, quote, defensive action, but from the point of view of the country on the other side of that arming, that looks like a pretty aggressive action, and it therefore triggers a response. It triggers a retaliation. It makes conflict more likely. So the United States poured arms into Ukraine after 2014. It thought it was going to make peace that way. Well, yeah, maybe some of these dunderheads in Washington believed that, but of course it was leading towards conflict. And the idea that the way to protect Taiwan is by making Taiwan what they call in Washington a porcupine, so armed that it won't be touched, with all those quills protecting it. This is absurd. The arms shipments would only make Taiwan more and more endangered, more and more at risk. The way to reduce, even eliminate these risks is diplomacy. Diplomacy between the United States and China, diplomacy between Taiwanese leaders and mainland Chinese leaders. Talk with each other. For heaven's sake, there is an absolute vital interest on both sides of the Taiwan Straits for peace. There really is. And if the United States would just get out of the way for a moment, and the two sides could talk with each other, they'd actually find a way forward. But the United States comes in with its naive and destabilizing promises. We'll keep you safe. Yeah, they'll keep Taiwan safe like they kept Afghanistan safe, like they kept South Korea safe, like they kept Ukraine safe. In other words, not at all. And how many failures do these neocons how many failures are they going to have before they are finally taken off the pedestal of power? By the way, it's not that the American people believe any of this. It's just that we don't have a functioning representative government. Our foreign policy has been taken in the hands of Raytheon and General Dynamics and these neocons. The American people are asked nothing about this. So this is not a reflection of the martial spirit of the American people, although our mainstream media feed a lot of absolute falsehoods to the American people. But it is the fact that foreign policy is in the hands of the security state, that is governed economically by the military-industrial complex, which funds the major committees in Congress, which provide the votes and the money for a $1 trillion plus annual military outlay. And that's where we are right now. It's absolutely awful. In the United States, foreign policy is the small preserve of the military-industrial complex.
I share that analysis with you. The oxymoron to me is that the United States keeps talking about itself. So, and I apologize again, the same people that you're talking about keep talking about the United States as a force for good and a force for peace, when in reality, the United States is highly militarized, highly militaristic, and reacts to conflict always with military components. That surprises me.
Well, I would add, I think since the end of the Second World War, the United States has been the most militarized and most violent country in the world. And this is just a matter of record. One recent scholarly account, a very good one, counted 70 U.S.-led regime change operations between 1947 and 1989. So the study was over the Cold War period. And just in that period, 1947 to 1989, 70 regime change operations, 6 of which were overt wars to overthrow a foreign government, and 64 were covert operations. Now, this is stunning. First of all, covert operations don't remain covert. It's pretty obvious if you're a reader of the New York Times, which wants you to suck your thumb and go to sleep. But if you're a thinker who's looking at the actual evidence, pretty clear when the U.S. is covertly overthrowing another government like it tried to do in Syria. Now, the point is that this is the normal U.S. modus operandi: war, coups, and overthrows. And after 1989, the big change wasn't that the United States stopped that behavior. The big change was the United States thought it could get away with anything, whether in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria. In 2011, Obama and Hillary, well, they decided, okay, we're going to overthrow Assad. That was just a conscious decision. And 12 years later, they left that country in shambles because they're fools. What do they think? That they can dictate? By the way, they said, both Obama and Trump, okay, we're going to overthrow Maduro. We'll do it through economic sanctions. They crushed the economy. And as stupid as they are in Washington, they said, okay, we'll now pretend that Maduro's not the president. We'll just name another president from outside, Juan Guaido. And you have to think, is this a cartoon? Is this a fairy tale? Are these idiots that they think that from Washington they can name the president of Venezuela? But they actually tried to do this for several years. And I have friends well, they wouldn't call me friends, but in academia in the East Coast in the US that said, okay, I'm going to work for the new Guaido government. I said, Guaido government, because the US names him as president, he's suddenly president, you're going to work for him? Come on. So this is a deep and continuing tendency. The United States, it seems to me, forgot any kind of diplomacy. Diplomacy means you sit down and you negotiate mutual concerns. And by the way, to be successful, you show respect to the other side. And you try to listen to the concerns of the other side so that you can find a durable solution. That whole approach has completely gone. They don't even know how to negotiate. They have no interest in negotiating. They don't talk about it. This is amazing to me.
And there is actually a new study that shows that the rate of foreign intervention of the United States picked up after 1989 and didn't slow down. So the idea that the end of the Cold War would reduce interventions is actually wrong. This can be shown now. And one last question to you. Reconciliation with Russia. You wrote recently a wonderful piece on your homepage about how Kennedy would have made peace, and I mean John F. Kennedy. And in that piece, though, supposes two things. One, Kennedy supposed that the US and USSR were equals, and two, he supposed that both states wanted to make peace. Now, it strikes me that both of these assumptions are not true anymore. Or do you think the US thinks of Russia as an equal and as somebody that they want peace with, unless it is with Russia in broken up?
Well, the neocons had a plan to try to either overthrow Putin or to so-called decolonize Russia. It's a vulgar thing. They didn't want to deal with Russia as a counterpart country for negotiations. On December 17, 2021, President Putin put on the table a draft U.S.-Russia security agreement. This was the last off-ramp to avoid Ukraine escalation in 2022. I urge the White House, talk now. Based on that document, there's a lot in there that's absolutely valid. Most importantly, stop the NATO enlargement to Ukraine, which has no sense and which is a Russian red line for completely understandable reasons. No, we don't talk to any third party about NATO, is the US refrain. That means we don't negotiate, we don't understand diplomacy, we don't recognize Russia's legitimate security concerns. And you end up with wars this way. Now, I continue to believe to this moment that if Biden said the words, we will recognize Russia's legitimate security concerns in a legitimate peace agreement that also respects Ukraine's sovereignty, that respects America's security interests and Russia's security interests, we could actually get to a negotiated peace. And pretty quickly, it would be based on Ukraine as a neutral country. A fact that Zelensky himself noted in a brief moment in 2022 until the United States told him to stop noting that and demanded that Ukraine shut down the negotiations. So Zelensky actually came back to what had been the basis of Ukraine's independence, the basis of its constitution, and the basis of an effective foreign policy for Ukraine neutrality. He came back to that. The United States tried to shut it down. Well, of course, the US policy is failing badly, not for the first time, for continuously failing, because this is American foreign policy, but it's destroying Ukraine in the process. Can the two sides, US and Russia, actually still end this through negotiations, this war? Of course they could, even today. I keep saying, to Biden, if you want to talk, I'll give you my Zoom link. You can make a Zoom link with Putin. Go ahead. You want to borrow my cell phone? Call him. Start negotiations. They're basically cowards in the US in the sense that they won't negotiate, because Kennedy put it right. He said, let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate. And they're afraid of negotiating in Washington, or they just forgot what it even means. So they don't have diplomats. I don't know what it is, but I've never seen anything like this. The absence of trying to find the way out of this disaster. And they need to open negotiations.
I was, by the way, an advisor to Mr. Borrell for a short time, unpaid but official advisor. And then I said one day that I thought that the United States had destroyed the Nord Stream pipeline, and he fired me that day. So that is how my career as advisor to the European Union ended, by my statement, which I still stand by, that the United States most likely destroyed the Nord Stream pipeline. The only competing theory now, by the way, is the one put forward by the United States, which is that Ukraine did it. So take your choice. But I think the United States probably did it, and it's probably not fair to blame Ukraine for this, but it's one or the other. It wasn't Russia. Everybody agrees that it wasn't Russia. In the U.S. intelligence community, their theory is it was Ukraine. That was in New York Times a few days ago. My theory is Seymour Hersh account that the United States did this. In any event, that brought an end to my illustrious advising the European Commission on foreign policy. Very abruptly, by the way. It took less than a day to end my career in that capacity. So I think the Professor
Müller?
Miller, yes.
But that was the master plan before.
Yeah, I will also say just a word. I think many of our differences are about the Euromaidan. I don't think it's incidental that Victoria Nuland was on tape 3 weeks before the violent overthrow of the government, because it ended with a shooting from the Maidan-controlled buildings and a storming of the government buildings. It was a violent overthrow. And she was on tape describing exactly what the next government would be. So she was planning this change. And I happen to have some direct, odd experience with this. I know that significant U.S. money flowed into the Maidan in ways that are really wrong, seriously wrong. And the United States played a significant role in this. So I don't dispute, of course, that neutrality was not the issue at that point, except for the U.S., which opposed Yanukovych. Yanukovych wanted neutrality, but the U.S. wanted a government that supported NATO enlargement, and it got it in the end, because by the end of 2014, the government was now calling for joining NATO. Of course, you know very, very well as an expert in this that the first act of the parliament, though not implemented, was to ban the Russian language. This brought into... No, is that...
Never a ban of Russian language. It was a change of the language law for regional minority languages being officially accepted.
That's correct. We agree. Okay, we agree. Thank you for the clarification. On the U.S. and Europe, I admit my imagination is often not good enough to know what they really have in mind. I don't think this is an anti-Europe venture of the United States, but it is a hegemonic venture, clearly, because that's not even subtle. The idea of the United States is the United States should have full spectrum dominance in all regions of the world. That's the idea. And of course, the two threats to that perceived by the United States are Russia and China. And so the U.S. foreign policy and strategic policy and defense policy are absolutely clear on these points. And I think that the basic idea is the U.S. likes Europe well enough, but it absolutely wants full dominance over Eurasia. And that's what Spig was talking about in the global chessboard, how to get full dominance over Eurasia. And he pointed out that control of Ukraine, he called it the geographic pivot of Eurasia. And that was the theory, and he spelled it out in detail. And I think it is the neoconservative vision that has been played out now for 30 years. So I don't think it's per se anti-European. It's not pro-European, it's pro-American. And it is, to my mind, extremely wrong-headed to think when you are 4.1% of the world population that you should run the world or aim to be the unrivaled power of the world, aim to have primacy everywhere. And there's so many vivid examples of how this thinking works. I'll give you one more that is interesting. A former colleague of mine, and then he became a very esteemed ambassador, Robert Blackwell, wrote in 2015 how the United States needed to confront China because China's rise was no longer in America's interest. And he spelled out all the measures that the United States should take to limit China's rise. And they're being followed one by one by one by one. For example, negotiate trade arrangements in Asia that exclude China. What a clever idea. Let's have trade in Asia, but not China, which is the main trade partner of all the Asian countries. Only America could invent such an idea. It's close your eyes, wish 3 times, and sprinkle fairy dust and good things will happen to you. It's bizarre, but these things are actually spelled out in print and then followed. Ban exports of technology. This was on the list in 2015. Sanctions, using the financial system, setting the rules for various technologies and trade, all spelled out precisely. So this is the question that consumes our international relations specialists. It consumes the think tanks in Washington. It consumes the American leadership, how to stay number one, which is, to me, a very uninteresting question, except that it is so dangerous to have that mindset. And that is, unfortunately, where we are. In 1989, I was asked to be economic advisor to Poland's Solidarity movement and then to its first post-communist government of Prime Minister Mazowiecki. And I mentioned earlier, I drafted a plan for them, and I created a framework for financial stabilization. And I wrote various key steps of that because that was my specialty at the time, and how to stabilize the currency, how to stabilize the financial system, how to stabilize the money, and so forth. The U.S. accepted everything I recommended. In fact, just to show you how it works, one day in September 1989, I had an idea for $1 billion stabilization fund to back the Polish currency. And I literally typed out the idea on one page at 8 in the morning. I went to see Senator Robert Dole, who was the Senate Majority Leader, at 9 in the morning. He told me to return at 10 in the morning, and there was General Scowcroft, the National Security Advisor. He said, "Jeffrey, explain it to General Scowcroft," and I did. General Scowcroft asked me, "Is this the best approach?" And I said, "I think it is, General." And he said, "Please call Senator Dole at the end of the day." At 5 p.m., I called Senator Dole, and he said, "Jeffrey, tell your Polish friends they have their $1 billion. So it was from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., literally. Okay, now, I made a number of recommendations, and I thought, pretty cool. They're all being accepted. And they worked, which is why President Gorbachev asked me for help. And I suggested similar strategies multiplied by 5, because that was the difference of the size, actually at the time multiplied by 10, because it was the Soviet Union in 1991. And Gorbachev was invited to the G7, and I and a team at MIT and Harvard presented what was called the Grand Bargain to support Gorbachev. This was even before Russian independence. The White House turned it down flat. Didn't even want a follow-up note or memo, just said, "We're not giving anything to the Soviet Union." Okay. Then Gorbachev came back from the G7 and was kidnapped, and in that putsch attempt, and Yeltsin emerged as the dominant political figure. And by September, Yeltsin had reached out to me, "Please come to Moscow to help us." So I came to Moscow and I explained. They said, "How did Poland stabilize its currency? How did Poland get its debt canceled?" and so forth. And I explained the dynamics. Well, can this work for Russia? Because we're going to have an independent Russia. And I said, it's important because you face financial collapse. And so this is very important. By the way, all my thinking was guided by John Maynard Keynes' Economic Consequences of the Peace, 1919. Don't end a war in disaster for the vanquished. You end up with what everybody knows. you end up with the risk of complete disaster a generation later. So this was very much on my mind, and I proposed a similar strategy for Russia. It was turned down completely. I said, but it already proved itself. The Secretary of State said to my face in early 1992, Mr. Sachs, suppose I even agreed with you on what you're saying. Suppose the Polish finance minister had said the same thing to me that you're saying. I want to give you a piece of advice, Mr. Sachs. It's not going to happen. Okay, very clear. Being very stubborn on my side, I didn't believe him, because usually anything I've wanted, I've had to argue for. But it didn't happen. It never happened. It didn't happen with Bush. It didn't happen with Clinton. The idea of the United States helping Russia to recover never crossed their mind for a moment. This is the most basic point. Russia's on the outside. We move the Iron Curtain several hundred kilometers to the east, but we still face this problem on the other side. That's the mindset. The motivation is being number one. The motivation is being number one. By the way, the motivation was we don't have to listen to anybody. We are the unipolar power. We are the most powerful country in the history of the world. And there's a famous, justly famous episode of Wesley Clark, who was the NATO commanding general under Clinton, going to the Pentagon in the early 1990s and being told specifically in 1992, I believe it is, that we're going to clean up now, clean up all those Soviet-backed governments, Iraq, Syria, Libya, blah, blah, blah. We're going to have a series of wars, he was told. And then after 2001, he was told the same thing. Now we can clean up everything. So this is an idea. It's a concept. It's a concept of state power, not a healthy one. And it's been deeply seated, and we're still at it. And these events are playing out in real time right now. They're extremely dangerous, and they're bringing us back to the brink of nuclear war. Because Russia does not want a US-led unipolar world. China does not want a US-led unipolar world. Indeed, outside of the EU, United States, UK, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore, nobody else wants a unipolar US world. So we have the West, so-called, with about maybe 15% of the world population, and the rest of the world saying, what are you doing? Could you make peace and calm down rather than breaking everything? Now, let me end by saying I'm not exonerating Russia's responsibilities. I'm saying that we could have avoided this conflict and we could end this conflict now. But we cannot end it on US terms of NATO enlargement. There is no path to that possible. I pointed out some of the limitations of the United States in a meeting, and he was furious with me. So I will reciprocate the frustration. He should know better, but he has signed on, let's say, to the US agenda. And I always considered Canada the sane part of North America. That's a little unfair to Mexico because Mexico's technically also North America, but of the two countries, I'm a Detroiter originally, so I always viewed Canada as my southern neighbor because we drove south from Detroit to get to Windsor. But let me just say, I always admired Canada as being kinder, gentler, more rational. And I'm still hoping for something better because Canada really can do better. And Canadian society, thank God, doesn't have the disasters the United States society has because it is a kinder, gentler country. But the policies are, there's a large Ukrainian emigre community. It's a powerful voting group. But the big misunderstanding is sending NATO to Ukraine is no friend to Ukraine. It's the biggest disaster. I mean, all of this war is the biggest disaster possible. That's what I tried to explain to my Ukrainian friends for years. Don't get into the middle of a proxy war of the United States. It destroys you. And that's what's happening to Ukraine. So I'm not against Ukraine. I'm trying to save Ukraine, not the way that the United States does it. The United States, quote, claimed to want to save Afghanistan. Well, there you have proof positive of what it means when the United States wants to save you. Please don't try that at home. It's really not a good idea. What I meant specifically about the vote, yes, if there's a vote, it'll pass if there's no public debate. But if there is a real public debate, and so this has procedures that it goes through both, it goes through committees in the House. There are witnesses. You testify. I testify. We bring people to Washington. We have an expression of the will of the American people. There's a good chance. And even I'm waiting for Rand Paul and others to just get 40 votes in the U.S. Senate, which would stop this as well. So I think that if this were ever democratized, we would actually have a real chance. The American people do not want this war. This is absolutely clear. And I think that, but they don't give us the chance for that kind of public debate. The U.S. is against neutrality because NATO is U.S. power. That's the basic idea. That is the neocon idea. They call it liberal hegemony. It's a ridiculous idea. But that has been the idea since 1992. And it's deep. As I explained, it's bipartisan. It's basically owned by the military-industrial complex. Victoria Nuland is probably the single best illustration of the deep state aspect of this, because in the early 1990s, or actually in the early 2000s, she was Cheney's security advisor. That's not a good start, by the way. The man who brought us multiple disasters. Then she became, under Bush Jr., the U.S. ambassador to NATO during 2005 to 2008. So she was a key point person in the commitment of NATO to enlarge. Then she became Hillary Clinton's spokesperson. You see, Democrat, Republican, it doesn't matter. Then she became Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs. And she was the person who coordinated the U.S. on the Maidan. And she's the one on the phone call, the fuck Europe phone call. Excuse her language. It's not my language. She's the one on that phone call. Then She's now Undersecretary of State. So this is both parties. This is continuity. This is a strategy. Why does NATO propose to open an office in Japan now? Really? Is NATO the U.S. expeditionary force for the upcoming Taiwan war? What could they conceivably be thinking? Why did the U.S. insist on inviting 4 Asia-Pacific leaders to NATO? Because they have no sense. Because they are looking towards a global war. So why they do this, I think it is what William Fulbright 60 years ago entitled a great book which people should read, The Arrogance of Power. They are drunk with power. And that's what this is about. And they don't know better. They're out of control.
So I have several questions on.
Let me just a quick.
Sorry for that.
Yeah, just to say.
The protests on the streets.
Yeah. So
basic rights.
Yeah. So the Vatican, unfortunately, was a little outside the Vatican because the Pope had surgery last weekend, it turned out in the end. And thank goodness he's recovering very well. But we had an event at the auditorium, Ara Pacis, which is the altar of peace under Augustus, just next to the Augustus mausoleum, just across the Tiber from the Vatican. And it was the 60th anniversary of John F. Kennedy's peace speech. And that is a speech I would recommend that everybody listen to again and again. I've made my family listen to it, I don't know how many times, but it's the greatest speech by an American leader in modern history. And he gave it 60 years ago, June 10, 1963. And we celebrated that by bringing together Carrie Kennedy, President Kennedy's niece, and Robert Kennedy's daughter, and Nina Khrushcheva, the granddaughter of Nikita Khrushchev, and Gillian Sorensen, the widow of Theodore Sorensen, who wrote the speech together with President Kennedy. So it was a wonderful occasion. And that speech was a speech at the height of the Cold War, telling the American people we can negotiate peace with the Soviet Union. It was extraordinarily brave, extraordinarily beautiful, extraordinarily wise, and it led to the partial nuclear test ban treaty 5 weeks after President Kennedy gave the speech. And the speech is filled with wisdom that we should take into account. One of the parts of the speech that we should take into account, and let me read you just this excerpt to get it exactly right, because it is extremely important for our survival. If I can find it, here it is. Above all, while defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world. So he said, don't put an adversary at the choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. Well, what is our goal every day? We must defeat Russia. We must humiliate Russia. We must teach Russia a lesson. President Kennedy didn't just say, don't do that. In this long and wonderful speech, he says, above all, we must avoid that. He knew what he was talking about. It was 8 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which nearly ended the world. So above all, we shouldn't be doing precisely what we're doing right now. President Biden should not be taunting Vladimir Putin. The number of times the word humiliating is put with delight in the English language press is really impressive. Russia's humiliation, Russia's humiliation. So what we're doing is exactly the opposite of what President Kennedy urged and what President Kennedy proved could actually lead to peace. So that's what we did in Rome.
Opinions say, after all, the world overwhelmingly has called for a ceasefire. And in the most recent UN General Assembly vote, it was 153 countries calling for a ceasefire, and the population of those countries is 89% of the world population. 10 countries opposed: the United States, Israel, and a few other small countries. The total population of those that opposed was 5%, of which 4% was the United States. So the U.S. was joined by 9 other countries that represented less than 1% of the world population. In other words, this is giving a finger, if I could put it crudely, to the rest of the world, saying, we don't care. We don't care what you say. We don't care what you call for. We don't care for peace. We'll do it the way we want to do it. This is not only the United States backing Israel, this is the United States alongside Israel, because Israel couldn't fight one day by itself. It needs the munitions every day from the United States, and it's getting them.
Yeah, you talk about ammunition. Jake Sullivan just recently said that they are taking care of this ammunition, these weapons that are sending to Israel, that they are not using against civilians. How
well, this is ridiculous. There are 18,000 dead minimum, 2 million displaced, hospitals, schools, basic physical infrastructure, apartment buildings, all destroyed. And even the New York Times, which is, of course, rabidly pro-Israel, and I mean pro-Israeli government policy, notes in an article today that a substantial proportion of the bombs are dumb bombs. They're not guided bombs. They even quote Mark Milley, the former chief of staff of the U.S. military, saying that this is wrong. You need to use guided missiles to avoid the civilian deaths and damage and injury. And of course, they're not doing that. Does Jake Sullivan know that? Of course, he knows that. This is part of a U.S. foreign policy that is as out of control as Israel's foreign policy. That's the problem.
The other issue that it's much more serious than Yemen is Hezbollah in the north. Israelis, they were talking about if it was necessary, they want to attack Hezbollah. Hezbollah has the same rhetoric. How do you see right now the situation in that region?
It seems, although I don't have any direct evidence because I don't speak to the administration, they certainly don't speak to me, but it seems that the hardliners in Washington and the hardliners in Jerusalem in the Israeli government want a wider war. They're not taking steps to avoid a wider war. They seem to want a wider war. I think it's Netanyahu's dream that the United States goes to war with Iran. Because if Israel could get the United States to take out Iran, and that's their idea, imagine that. But all of this is grotesque cynicism and miscalculation as well, because what could happen would be devastating for the whole world if this continues to escalate. And they're playing with that. You notice that Israel hasn't taken one moment, not one measure, not one iota of an approach towards diplomacy. Nothing. No call for diplomacy. Incredible disrespect for the United Nations, disrespect for the rest of the world. Obviously saying every day we don't care about the rest of the world. We don't care about diplomacy. I think one of the things that will happen is that support in the United States for Israel will collapse. Actually, it's already collapsing among young people, and I think the collapse will be more widespread. Even that doesn't necessarily stop the U.S. government from doing what it's doing by any means, because foreign policy is hardly an area of democratic deliberation. It's a small cabal that runs things, that controls the military. They don't really ask for permission. But we see in Ukraine how an exasperated public finally has some influence on some members of Congress, enough that there isn't just a blank check for more armaments. This is very surprising given how much our Congress likes to write checks to the military industrial complex. But the public is pretty much disgusted, and Biden's support is falling sharply. We have an election year this year, so it's possible that the exasperation clearly expressed in opinion survey after opinion survey will finally result in some action by the U.S. government to put a stop to this massive devastation.
At the end of the day, what is so important is how these actions would benefit the people of Israel. What's going on in the mind of the Netanyahu administration? How possibly they can think that all these actions would benefit Israelis?
They are engaged in ethnic cleansing right now, and that is the goal of this government. This government is an extreme right-wing government. Netanyahu's party, the Likud, has, since its charter in 1977, demanded one state of Israel, commanding all of the territories of Palestine, as well as the 1967 border Israel. In other words, the land from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River should be Israel. That's the policy. That's the policy across the cabinet. That's the policy of these religious Zionist parties. For example, the finance minister Smotrich and the defense minister Gallant, who's Likud, and the Interior Minister Ben-Gvir, who is another party calling for, quote, greater Israel. That's their policy, is that there should never be a Palestine. There should never be Palestinian political rights. This is Israel. And a lot of the public supports that. And a lot of the public follows the line of the administration, the Israeli government, that is, that the only way to safety is to smash Palestine. And so the situation is going to continue, I think, if it's a matter of internal Israeli policy. But it's something that Israel can't do for a day without the United States. And the U.S. has no interest, no national interest, no ethical interest, no geopolitical interest in being an accessory to mass murder.
How do you see the left, the center, political parties in Israel? Because the left is so weak right now. Why the Netanyahu administration during all these years did this to the left, to the center?
There's basically no left in Israel. It's a few seats in the Knesset, in the parliament. The Israeli political scene has shifted to the far right over the years. It didn't just start on October 7. This is something that's been going on for years. Netanyahu represents and those parties represent a larger viewpoint. Israel's basically divided between those who oppose a Palestinian state because they think that God gave them all the land, and they're going to assert their biblical claim, and those who follow the propaganda that say, well, even if it was right to have two states, there's no one on the other side that would accept that, and so better we have to use violence and force. That's the only realistic thing to do. But voices that say we need to solve these problems through following international law and through justice barely exist in Israel right now. I think this is a terrible, grave danger to Israel's survival because the legitimacy internationally is plummeting. And I personally don't think that the American people really have much interest in being a party to this. The American people, to the extent that they signed up with Israel, signed up to a two-state solution. They did not sign up to some biblical vision of a greater Israel that controls millions of Palestinian people. They didn't sign up for that.
Putin's recent press conference, he was talking about Odessa. He said that Odessa is a Russian city. It's a huge change in his view. The United States could have saved Odessa for Ukraine if they were going to negotiate with Russia before. How do you see the situation right now in Ukraine? Is there any will in the Biden administration to go after negotiations?
No. In 2010, 2011, 2013, Russia's demands vis-a-vis Ukraine were that Ukraine should be neutral. That's all. And Russia negotiated with the government of Ukraine a lease till the year 2042 for Sevastopol naval base. There were no demands for annexation. There were no demands for territory. There was no claim on Crimea. There was simply a pragmatic approach. Don't join the U.S. military alliance, and our military base, our naval base, which has been in Sevastopol, Crimea, since 1783, should remain there, and we want a long-term lease for that, which President Yanukovych negotiated. That's all the demands. Then the United States overthrew or was party to the overthrow of Yanukovych. Russia took back Crimea. Even then, there were no demands for the eastern Ukrainian regions, that is the Donbass. What Russia said was stop killing ethnic Russians, give autonomy to ethnic Russians, and that became the basis for the so-called Minsk I and Minsk II agreements. The Minsk II agreement did not call for independence of the Donbass or that Russia would annex the Donbass. It just said autonomy. And it was a position backed up unanimously by the UN Security Council. But the United States said, no, we don't care. Told Ukraine, you don't have to implement that. And so that was lost. Even as late as December 2021, Putin was not making demands for territory. He was calling for the Minsk agreements to be enforced, claiming Crimea and demanding that NATO stop enlarging. Well, the United States government is deaf to the interests of any other place in the world. They're so arrogant that the position is we don't have to listen to anything. And so when President Putin put a draft security agreement on the table based on those premises that NATO would not enlarge, that the Minsk agreement would be honored finally years after it was supposed to go into effect, Biden said, we don't have to negotiate. Russia launched its special military invasion in March 2022. And by then, the Duma, the Russian parliament, had recognized eastern Ukraine as independent, Lugansk and Donetsk as independent, did not annex them. That came in September 2022. But in March, it recognized their independence, but Russia demanded Ukrainian neutrality and said on that basis there could be immediate peace. And Ukraine and Russia famously were close to an agreement on ending the war weeks after it had started. Weeks. And the United States said no. And Britain said no. We will not support you. You fight on. Hundreds of thousands of people, Ukrainian young men, have died since then. So this is about American foreign policy, and it's so sad. It is not just demands for territory by Russia. It is the fact that Russian demands keep rising in the context of continuing rejections from the United States. Definitely, the rhetoric has turned even more aggressive, but the White House is so stupid. Sorry, in the U.S., they don't understand anything. But what they certainly don't understand is that Biden should call Putin and say, we've got to stop this. We don't want to see all of Ukraine destroyed. But you're right. We should never have tried to expand NATO. That was really stupid. And you told us that since 2007. That's the call that's needed. But I don't think Biden's up to it. And certainly his neocon team opposes that very premise. Fight on, basically kidnap young people off the streets of Ukrainian cities and throw them to the front line where they're dying by the hundreds, sometimes thousand or more per day. That's the policy.
In Europe, we are seeing that new leaders that are coming to power in Netherlands, in Slovakia, we had Orban. They are against this war in Ukraine, against sending more aids, more weapons to Ukraine. How influential would that be on the U.S. foreign policy in Ukraine? It's
having an effect, obviously. Orban by himself blocked the formal approval of the next round of European assistance. Fico in Slovakia will be joining that cause. The government in the Netherlands is still being negotiated, but the party that came out number one, as you said, Wilders, is against further aid. Of course, the new Polish government is pretty gung-ho for more financial and military support to Ukraine. Things are dragging out, but most of Europe does their best to follow blindly the United States. This is really tragic, though all of these cracks in the foundation are clearly appearing. What's stunning is if you look up approval rating of world leaders, and one of the websites that reports weekly opinion polling, there's not a European leader that has a net positive approval rating. Most of them are incredibly unpopular. Scholz, Jonas Gahr Støre in Norway, Macron, hugely unpopular. They're promoting war is not winning public support. There's no one in Europe that has a net positive approval rating in this group of NATO boosters, not even close. And the ratings keep going down and down. Look what's happening to Scholz in Germany. It's a collapse of public support. And in the United States, Biden does not have public support for his foreign policy.
We know that Austria is trying to block the new package of sanctions on Russia. Is that possible that Austria can make some middle ground for both sides?
I think that more and more politicians in Europe are understanding this is wrong. It was a terrible mistake. It's not working. They generally are so beholden to the United States, or for one reason or another afraid of it or bought off, that they don't say in public what they often say in private. But there are more European politicians coming to the fore, definitely saying we've got to stop this, and that will have an effect, not from one day to the next, but it's definitely coming. Similarly, in the United States, public opinion is gone for this. Congress, which listens to the military-industrial complex, is in angst because they want to vote more money for weapons. The Democrats want to support Biden, but it's completely wrong-headed to be sending tens of billions of dollars more without even an attempt at negotiations. So I think that this is a failing policy that will come to an end. It has to, and it doesn't have to, but it's very likely to in 2024. But it's agonizingly slow. And what is so frustrating is the absence of many voices of sanity. Viktor Orban in Hungary is one of them. Fico is a voice of sanity. There are very few right now.
As you mentioned, the US foreign policy is so important. What's happening to the Democratic Party? We know that Cornel West, Jill Stein, even Bobby Kennedy, they're not welcome in the Democratic Party. They have to find their way of fighting in the new election. What the Democratic Party is losing for the next election? How do you see their situation?
Well, I'll give you a personal answer. They lost my vote. I used to be a Democrat. I used to vote Democratic basically all my life. And I have left the party. And I put it in personal terms because I think I reflect a view that is quite widespread. The Democratic Party for me is unrecognizable right now. When I joined the Democrats, I joined originally in the 1960s as I was still in high school, so I was a kid. But the idea was it was at least the part of our political system that was against the Vietnam War. And there was always a strong leftist part of the Democratic Party that was anti-war. And that was what I felt was my home. Now there isn't any anti-war part of the Democratic Party at all. Not in the Congressional Democratic Party, not in the White House. You don't find, other than a very, very few people, any voice for this right now. All the mainstream voices are more war, more funding. The Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, was at school same time I was at Harvard. I've known him for many, many decades. What's his role right now? Well, keep the Senate in session so that we can still send more money to Ukraine. It's terrible. There's no thinking anymore. It's incredibly ignorant. And this is across the Democratic Party. So it's really quite upsetting.
Is the political arena of the United States ready to have a third party, even fourth party? We have Bobby Kennedy, who was not welcome in the Democratic Party. I don't know what they're thinking of, but he has a very good chance of getting more votes from the Democratic Party. We have Cornel West and Jill Stein. Those are so important candidates to make some equilibrium within the Democratic Party.
I think the mainstream Democrats are extremely confused and befuddled, and the wrong message, and they've lost their way. And Biden is a terrible candidate and has been basically a warmonger during this whole period. So it is a position that is outside of American public opinion right now. They've opened the door more for Trump than just about anything else. I sensed it from the beginning. that strangely, because it's a principle of American politics that foreign policy is not decisive, I said, you're going to go down on the foreign policy, which is really something. It was so bad, so misconceived. I wrote a few articles about that this makes no sense, even politically, much less geopolitically, if I could put it that way. It makes no sense in terms of domestic politics. And this is how things are playing out right now. The American public rejects Biden's foreign policy. He is not going to win re-election, most likely, and certainly not on this approach.
And I wanted you to specifically comment on Cornel West and Jill Stein.
Because they're fine people. They're not going to be president, most likely. They're fine people. Bobby Kennedy has a much larger following and a much larger position in the polls. And we'll see what the dynamics are now. There are, Cornel West is a wonderful person. I've been friendly with him for decades. I don't know Jill Stein personally, but it's Bobby Kennedy that has the name, the public recognition, the position in the opinion polls, and he certainly has an open chance. I urge him all the time, be the candidate of peace. You'll win if you're the candidate of peace. This is really important. This is what the American people want.
Is it possible for him to convince Cornel West or even Jill Stein to be part of his campaign?
Well, I think right now, they're each going to do their thing. They're each going to run. We're still almost a year away from the election. So a lot can happen between now and next November, and we'll see. But for the moment, they're going to campaign. Right now, Bobby Kennedy shows up in the opinion surveys typically between 10 and 20% of support. That's a lot for a third party candidate. And we're early days because most Americans are not really focused on the elections. This is still very much a professional politician thing at this point, and it will only start to heat up at the beginning of next year with primaries and caucuses, and then we'll see how things evolve.
Just before wrapping up this session, I want to know your opinion on this U.S. economic war on China. How is it going with these two conflicts in Ukraine and in Israel? We know that China is they're doing their way, they're growing. And how do you see right now in the U.S.? Are they focused on the economy? Are they focused on these wars? How these wars going to benefit the economy?
It is pretty much taken for granted among the mainstream of both the Democratic and the Republican parties, I have to say, that China's an enemy. And the rhetoric vis-a-vis China is extremely stupid, low level, ignorant, and dangerous. And this is both parties, because even parts of the Republican Party that are not interested in the Ukraine war or want to stop the funding to a significant extent say, yes, because we need the resources to fight China. And so there's a kind of comic book feeling to it that, there could be a war with China. That would just be fine and dandy. Of course, it could end the world. It's so reckless and dangerous, the way that our politicians talk, the way the mainstream media report things, say, coming war with China, as if that's, a normal kind of statement. As opposed to something absolutely horrifying. And the rhetoric about Taiwan as if Taiwan is the 51st American state, as if the United States doesn't have a one China diplomatic policy, which they seem to forget. It's all quite dangerous. The U.S., starting with Obama in political ways, starting with Trump in trade policies, and now with Biden in trade policies, finance policies, technology policies.